This is the virtual community day for the local salt marsh restoration and community science in the Charleston area. My supervisor Evie isn't here because she has another project that she's working on this evening, but I will be leading the presentation tonight. So moving in, make sure to please mute yourself and enter any questions you have in the chat box or in the discussion board that I'm now sending in the chat. It's through a website called Padlet, and it allows us to look at all the discussion questions as a group at the end of the presentation. So if at any point you have a quick little question or quick little comment, you can add it into our Zoom chat, or you can add it into that Padlet link, and that Padlet link will allow us to all look at it together. Alrighty. So the first thing we're going to do is work on this Slido activity. And this allows us to create a word cloud to see what does the salt marsh mean to you. So you can join at slido.com and you type this 6-digit code in, or you can just scan this little QR code and it'll pull you straight up to that screen. So I'm gonna leave this up for a couple moments and then I'll switch over to the word cloud. And as soon as you get the Slido pulled up, just start typing in short words, phrases that makes you think of what the salt marsh is to you, and how it impacts your life or what you enjoy about it, anything, everything. Just what do you think of when you hear about the salt marsh? And I will switch over to the Slido page now. Let's see. Got one word, salty. That's a good one. I'll just leave it here for like 2 minutes and we can just type in all the words and phrases we think about when we hear the word salt marsh and when we think about the salt marsh. And this is a really cool platform online for free where you can see submissions going in live. It's kind of fun. We did it last year as well. And also let me know if you can't hear me. Sometimes I do end up speaking softly. So you can shoot in the chat box and let me know, hey, Amanda, we can't hear you. Speak up. Great. Kayaking is really great around here, but I try to go only when the mosquitoes are died down. Just get us in the mindset of being in the marsh while we work into this presentation. Awesome. These are all great. There's a small group of us, so this can be a little bit more casual too if you want to jump in. If your comment or question is really quick, I don't mind taking a quick pause and having that back and forth discussion with you all, since there's only like a handful of us in here. So all these words are great. Wet, obviously, and it helps us when things get a little too wet too. So that's great. I love the seabirds. Peaceful grass. I love watching it wave in the wind. So that's great stuff, you guys. Let's go back to the presentation. Alrighty. So why is the salt marsh so important? You guys mentioned a couple of things, but there's some other specific roles that the salt marsh plays for us, and I wanted to talk about them through a series of metaphors. So I'm going to show an icon, certain type of object, and it represents the role the salt marsh plays. So first, we have a pacifier. When you think of a pacifier, you think of babies. So yes, the salt marsh is a nursery. It's a nursery for a lot of marine creatures, and some of them live their whole life in the marsh, and a lot of them live only their younger years in the marsh, and they migrate out once they get older. Next one is a sponge. So a sponge signifies how the salt marsh serves as a buffer during storms, flooding, intense rain events, in general, hurricanes, all that intense like downpour that we get. We have a buffer in between our terrestrial system and our coastal system where the salt marsh absorbs a lot of that water, and it provides that big amount of margin in between our homes and our roads and the ocean that's having really big storm surges, or they're just really high tides, anything like that. So it serves as a buffer. Next, we have some cutlery. So this signifies the nutrients that salt marsh provides, not only for us in the form of a lot of seafood we eat, like blue crab and oysters and shrimp, but also for the ecosystem. It is a micro habitat for all sorts of creatures that we can't see, as well as all the great, cool, big creatures we see, like dolphins and birds and gators and all those great megafauna. So it's a really concentrated area of nutrients. And the marsh serves that for not only the marine environment, but also some of the terrestrial environment. The next metaphor object is a coffee filter. So the salt marsh serves as a filtration device. As runoff comes off of the land and washes into the ocean, it often passes through salt marshes. And from there, Spartina, as well as the pluff mud, will filter out toxins from a lot of our runoff. And then also oysters filter a lot of salt water as well. And they filter out all the mucky stuff in the water, and they can clear up the water really well. So not only is it the Spartina and the pluff mud, but it's also the oysters. And last but not least is charcoal. So charcoal is concentrated carbon. So this represents how the salt marsh is a carbon sink. This means this is where carbon ends up at. Carbon's all tied up in all the creatures that live in the salt marsh, such as the Spartina, all the trees, and all the critters that live in the mud. Because of that, there's less carbon that's floating up in the atmosphere. So then we have less carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and more carbon fixed into all these creatures and all these plants, where it kind of offsets climate change. So moving forward, let's talk about what stresses the salt marsh. So if you look at the map diagram to the right, you can see from 1973 into 2020, the red area has increased significantly. Well, that's all urban development. So urban development causes, like I said earlier, runoff, and we have a lot of habitat loss as well as we develop the land. And since Charleston is a huge port city as well, we have a lot of boat activity that causes a lot of disturbance in the salt marsh that otherwise wouldn't be there. We also have other stressors such as coastal erosion, which happens from a multitude of reasons, but essentially that's just when our shorelines are receding. We have less amount of land above the sea level. And I know a lot of people have witnessed this in their own communities and even on their own land that they own. Sea level rise is something that also is stressing the marsh, and it's slowly happening. It's not as intense and short on short timescales as the urban development and the coastal erosion. However, since Charleston is so close to sea level rise is very critical to the way that the salt marsh is operating and how much land it covers. So how can we help our salt marshes? This project, which is funded by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, specifically the National Marine Fisheries Service, has dedicated all this funding and this grant to help us restore this critical fisheries habitat, which is the entire salt marsh. It's a 3-year project we started back in 2019. Naturally, as soon as 2020 hit, we hit some bumps along the road with COVID. And so most of our work started in 2020, and this is our last year. And we end in 2022. So I'm excited that I got to meet everybody that I could, and I hope I get to meet more people in the future as this project starts to close. So let's talk about how overall this project is trying to address salt marsh restoration. It's a two-pronged approach with oyster reef restoration and smooth cordgrass planting. Smooth cordgrass is what we know as Spartina alterniflora, but scientists have taxonomically renamed it to Sporobolus alterniflorus. But since Spartina is the way that most of us recognize this awesome grass that lives in the marsh, I'm just going to say Spartina for the rest of the presentation, but that is just referencing Sporobolus. So we have 13 sites all over the Charleston County that have either or marsh grass plantings or oyster reef building, and some sites have both. And our project objective is not only to restore the salt marsh, but also to engage communities in these restoration projects in a new way that incorporates community science and allows all the community participants not only to be able to help with restoration events, but also have long-term involvement with the whole full circle of what restoration is. So this project came to be from a lot of established partnerships before, based in local agencies such as South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, which is the lead agency for this project. The Shellfish Research section homes the PI of this project, Peter Kingsley Smith. And in this area, SCDNR, they focus on researching how shellfish reefs and impact the marsh. So they're not only doing restoration efforts, but they're seeing what are the repercussions of all these efforts that we're doing out in the marsh. So they do really cool scientific work, such as testing different types of reef building, as well as monitoring these reefs after they're established, seeing how well these oysters are growing, if they're even recruiting to all these different types of oyster reefs they're building, and they access it from the land and from boat. So it's pretty cool what they do. Another program at SCDNR that helped inspire this project is the SCORE program, which is a statewide oyster recycling enhancement program. And this has been focused in community engagement as well. As you can see in the left picture, you see volunteers bagging oysters and creating a little assembly line to get them out into the marsh. Last but not least, we have the South Carolina Sea Grant Consortium's From Sea to Shoreline program, which is an educational program focusing in K-12 schools to teach students about the salt marsh grass life cycle. So they learn how to cultivate Spartina from the seed all the way to a mature plant and to go plant those plants they grew from the seed right back into the salt marsh. So you can see the middle picture, you have a student collecting seeds. And then we have students on the right playing in the puff mud and also planting. So it's a great experience for them to understand how they can be a steward in their own environment. So with the community science aspect, it creates a new layer of community engagement because you get to participate in all these specific volunteer trainings to help contribute to the scientific process of salt marsh restoration. I'll be talking through the different types of trainings that we have, but the in-person trainings always occur at our volunteer events where you learn how to strip seeds from Spartina grasses, which is going to be happening starting this week into December. And then also learning how to germinate these seeds, get them planted, and then how do you go and plant them back into the marsh? And so it becomes all full circle. And all this data that we collect as community scientists get to be crowdsourced on this free online platform called Anecdata, and I'll talk a little bit more about that And then you also get trained not only how to plant these guys out in the marsh and plant these oyster reefs, but we're also getting trained on how to monitor how well these grasses and these oysters are doing in the marsh after we plant them. So an online short course, which is created by one of our partners on the project, Clemson Cooperative Extension, is a living shorelines short course where you get to do, I think it's a 5-chapter online module consisting of a presentation with a like a guided instruction, and it's one of our lead personnel from each one of these great agencies that are partnering on this project, and we are all talking about the background of the salt marsh and how we as communities that live on the coast can help benefit our local environment by building these living shorelines. So if you're interested in participating in this living shoreline short course, it's free and it's online, and I can send the link out in a following date just to wrap up with everybody. So this has been great, and Clemson did a great job developing this. The next part of the training is the Anecdata app. Anyone can join and everyone can view the data once you're joined. And that is a great aspect to our community science project, because a lot of times as a participant, you gather the data, but you don't know where it goes. And you gather the data and you send it off to the scientists, and the scientists they analyze it. But we want you guys to be able to understand how all this data gets developed together, and not developed together, but collected together, not only by the research scientists, but also by the community scientists. So it's a great online free platform. You can access it through the web, or you can download the phone app. And I know South Carolina Aquarium utilizes this app for a lot of their community scientists projects as well. So this has been great with being able to crowdsource all our data, and you as a member can go through and see all the data that everybody else has gathered. So monitoring is a new approach in this project that separates it from other community engagement projects from salt marsh restoration. And this is where volunteers get to participate in learning the methodologies and technologies we utilize to understand how well are these living shorelines being, how are they doing after we plant them, essentially. So you can see all these really cool photos. In the top right, you see some folks from the shellfish research section flying a drone. So they gather aerial data, and you can be part of that and watching how they develop or how they gather that data. You do have to have like special like licensing and all that paperwork kind of stuff to fly a drone, but it is really cool to watch them do it. I can't personally do it, but we also get to gather data on the oyster recruitment. So you can see in the bottom left photo, you can see this little quadrant, and I assume that they count all the little tiny oysters, every individual oyster, and see how well they're doing. We do the same thing for the salt marsh grass. So in the top left photo, you can see some folks putting a quadrant out into the grass, and they count all the grass within that area. And from there, they sample it, and that provides a representative of how the entire marsh system is doing. So it's been really cool doing these monitoring events. We had our first round of community science monitoring in September and October. And we had a lot of folks who planted at those very sites come out again and keep tabs on how their plants were doing that they just planted this past summer. It has been great. It was really fun seeing how well they've been doing. And then also it was very rewarding seeing that they didn't all get washed away. We've been having crazy storms and pretty intense rainfall. So it was really, I was really happy to see a lot of our plants were still doing okay. So achievements are this past year, like I said before, we have 13 sites on this project, and 12 out of the 13 sites have received the oyster reef building or the Spartina planting that is designated to every site. So that's great, despite COVID-19 and all the bumps and obstacles that it presented to us this past year. Our impact this past year, we've had almost 400 volunteers. With the oyster reef installations, we've got 2,000 feet of bag shelled and wire reef. And then over an acre of loose shell being planted into the salt marsh. And loose shell is important because oysters like to build on top of old oysters. So that's why we like SED&R focuses on planting loose shell. Spartina planting, we had a great output with all of that. We collected over 3 million seeds, which is crazy. So if you want to help contribute to that giant number, we have some events coming up. We had over 50,000 plants planted into the salt marsh all over Charleston. So that's great news. And overall, it was half an acre of Spartina. So now we have had such a great outcome with everybody coming out and making this impact possible. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to make this large of an impact without all the community scientists and the volunteers' participation. I wanted to mention how coir logs or coir fiber is also part of the oyster reef installation. So they're just these logs of cocoa fiber that we use to stabilize eroding shoreline. So you can see on the left side, they're installing one of these coir logs, and then in front of that, they put oyster bags. So it helps stabilize that weak shoreline. And then behind that, we can start planting Spartina. And then on the right side, you see those wire reefs that also provide a substrate or a habitat for oysters to colonize upon. So we've had a great impact this past year. And if you want to participate in our next year's impact, please get involved. This is me and my supervisor, Evie, out in the field planting Spartina with some great volunteers. And it was a good time, even though I fell into the pluff mud a couple times, but that just comes with the territory, right? So if you're interested in becoming involved, if you've attended or if you've ever expressed interest in this program, you're definitely going to receive all the opportunities that we have coming up. So if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Here's my email if you haven't already received emails from me before. But this was a pleasure. Thank you so much for listening. And if you've already participated in this project, thank you so much for dedicating your time to this great cause and making a big difference in your local environment as well as your local community.